The rain hammered against the tall windows of La Sirena di Notte, like 1,000 impatient fingers demanding entry. Inside the restaurant, crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across white tablecloths and polished silverware, creating an atmosphere of wealth and discretion that attracted Manhattan's most dangerous elite. Isabella Romano moved through the dining room with practiced invisibility, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her movements efficient and unobtrusive. She had learned in her 2 years working here that the key to survival was simple. Serve quietly, speak only when spoken to, and never, ever make eye contact with the wrong people. At 24, she had perfected the art of being present, yet unseen, a ghost in a starched white shirt and black vest who delivered expensive wine and collected generous tips without leaving an impression. Tonight felt different, though, charged with an electric tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The private dining room in the back had been reserved by Dante Morello, a name that made even the restaurant's owner, Vincent Caruso, nervous. Isabella had seen Dante exactly 3 times before, always from a distance, always accompanied by men in dark suits who looked like they could break you in half with their minds alone. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that showed traces of silver at the temples, and eyes so cold they seemed to freeze whatever they looked at. But it wasn't Dante who caught Isabella's attention during those brief glimpses. It was the little boy who always sat beside him, a child of perhaps 6 years old, with enormous brown eyes and curly dark hair that fell across his forehead. The boy never spoke, never smiled, just sat perfectly still like a miniature adult, protected by an invisible wall of fear and power. The other waitresses whispered about them when management wasn't listening, spinning theories about who the child was and why a mafia boss would bring him to business meetings. Some said the boy was his son, others claimed he was a nephew or godchild. But everyone agreed on one thing. Luca Morello was untouchable, sacred, protected by the same deadly loyalty that kept his father alive in a world where trust was currency and betrayal meant death. Isabella tried not to think about it as she balanced a tray of espresso cups and navigated between tables where conversations stopped the moment she approached. She had her own problems, her own secrets, and getting curious about the guests was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her grandmother had always said that curiosity killed more than cats in their family, a warning Isabella understood better than most people would. The Romano family had fled Sicily when Isabella was just 2 years old, escaping debts and dangers that her parents never fully explained. Her grandmother, Nonna Francesca, had been the keeper of their history, the one who taught Isabella the Sicilian dialect during long afternoons in their cramped Bronx apartment, filling her head with stories of sun-drenched villages, lemon groves, and a family honor that had been lost to time and violence. Nonna had died 3 years ago, taking most of those stories with her, leaving Isabella with a language that felt like a secret handshake to a world she had never truly known. She pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, loading her tray with the last course for the private room, when Vincent grabbed her arm with surprising urgency. His round face was flushed, sweat beading at his hairline despite the restaurant's perfect temperature control. He was nervous, which meant something had gone wrong. And when Vincent was nervous, everyone suffered. His fingers dug into her arm like claws, and she had to resist the urge to pull away, knowing that any sign of disrespect could cost her the job she desperately needed to pay off her mother's mounting medical bills. The cancer treatments were bleeding them dry, sucking every dollar from Isabella's paychecks and forcing her to work double shifts just to keep their small apartment. She couldn't afford to lose this position, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. Vincent's breath smelled like garlic and anxiety as he leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting in the quiet kitchen. He told her that Maria, the senior waitress who usually handled the private room, had called in sick at the last minute, which was probably a lie because Maria never got sick, and Vincent needed Isabella to take over service for Mr. Morello's table immediately. Isabella's stomach dropped. She had never served the private room before, never been trusted with the guests whose names appeared in newspapers under headlines about organized crime and federal investigations. Vincent must have been truly desperate to send her in there, a relative newcomer with no experience handling the kind of men who could make problems disappear with a phone call. She wanted to refuse, to claim she wasn't ready, but Vincent's grip tightened, and his eyes held a warning she understood without words. Do this, or find another job. So she nodded, smoothed down her vest, and picked up the tray with hands that trembled only slightly. The walk to the private room felt like miles, though it was only 30 feet through the main dining area. Isabella focused on her breathing, on keeping her steps steady and her expression neutral, channeling every lesson her grandmother had taught her about dignity under pressure. The Romano women were survivors, Nonna Francesca used to say. We bend, but we don't break. We serve, but we don't surrender. Those words had carried Isabella through poverty, through her father's disappearance when she was 12, through her mother's diagnosis and the slow crumbling of everything she had once believed was solid. She could do this. She had to do this. The door to the private room was heavy oak with brass fixtures, closed against the casual observers who might glance in from the main floor. Isabella balanced the tray on one hand and knocked softly, waiting for the response that would grant her entry into a world she had always observed from the outside. A voice called out, deep and rough, giving permission, and she pushed through into a space that felt immediately different from the rest of the restaurant. It was darker here, more intimate, with wood-paneled walls and a single long table, where 5 men sat in expensive suits that probably cost more than Isabella made in 6 months. At the head of the table sat Dante Morello, and for the first time, Isabella saw him up close. He was even more imposing than she had imagined, with sharp features that looked carved from marble, and eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they touched. His suit was impeccable, navy with a subtle pinstripe, and a gold watch caught the light as he gestured while speaking to the man on his left. But it was the child beside him who drew Isabella's attention, despite her best efforts to remain focused on her task. Luca sat perfectly still in his chair, which had been raised with cushions to bring him level with the table, his small hands folded in his lap, like he was attending a funeral instead of a dinner. He wore a miniature version of his father's suit, complete with a tiny tie that someone had knotted with obvious care, and his dark eyes followed Isabella's every movement with an intensity that felt wrong for someone so young. She began serving the desserts, moving clockwise around the table, setting down plates of tiramisu and panna cotta with mechanical precision. The men barely acknowledged her presence, continuing their conversation in Italian peppered with English phrases, discussing territories and percentages and problems that needed handling. Isabella kept her eyes down, her movements smooth, becoming the invisible servant she had trained herself to be. She was almost finished, had only 2 plates left on her tray, when Luca suddenly pushed back his chair and stood up. The conversation stopped immediately. Every man at the table turned to look at the boy, and Isabella froze in place, unsure whether she should continue or retreat. Dante's hand moved toward his son, not threatening, but cautious, like he was approaching something fragile that might shatter. But Luca wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at Isabella, his enormous eyes fixed on her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. Curiosity mixed with something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. Then he did something that made Isabella's heart skip. He walked directly toward her, his small feet silent on the thick carpet, and stopped just inches away. She could smell the faint scent of expensive soap and laundry detergent, could see the way his curls caught the light. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in a bubble of stillness while the rest of the room held its breath. When Luca finally spoke, his voice was small and clear, carrying easily in the sudden silence. Posso avere dell'acqua, per favore? The request was simple. Could I have some water, please? But it was delivered in perfect Italian with a Sicilian accent that hit Isabella like a physical blow. Without thinking, without calculating the consequences. She responded in the same dialect, the words flowing from her mouth before her brain could stop them, pure and natural as breathing. Certo pichiridru, ti la porto subitu. Of course, little one. I'll bring it to you right away. The silence that followed Isabella's words was absolute, so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like drums announcing an execution. Every eye in the room had turned toward her, and she realized with dawning horror what she had just done. She had spoken without being spoken to, had used a dialect that marked her as clearly as a fingerprint, had broken the cardinal rule of invisibility by revealing something true about herself. The tray trembled in her hands, the remaining dessert plates rattling slightly, and she wanted desperately to take back those words, to swallow them down and pretend they had never existed. But it was too late. Luca's face had transformed completely, his usual mask of careful composure shattering like glass to reveal pure, unfiltered joy. His mouth fell open in a perfect circle of surprise. His eyes went wide and bright, and then he was moving, spinning away from Isabella, and running back to the table with a speed that made the bodyguards tense and reach inside their jackets. The boy launched himself at Dante, scrambling up onto his father's lap with a lack of grace that suggested this was not his normal behavior, and grabbed the older man's face between both small hands. Isabella watched in frozen fascination as this child, who had seemed so adult and controlled moments before, became exactly what he should have been all along, a 6-year-old boy excited beyond measure by something wonderful. Luca's voice came out in a rush, Italian words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to be understood, his small hands shaking his father's face for emphasis. Papà, papà, l'hai sentita? Parla come parlava la mamma, proprio uguale, le stesse parole che la mamma usava per dirmi buonanotte. Dad, did you hear her? She speaks like Mom used to speak, exactly the same words Mom used to say goodnight to me. The impact of those words was immediate and devastating. Dante Morello, the man who controlled territories and commanded armies of loyal soldiers, who was said to have ice water in his veins and steel where his heart should be, went completely still. His face, which had been merely cold before, became something else entirely. A mask of such carefully controlled emotion that Isabella could see the effort it took to maintain it. His jaw clenched hard enough that muscles jumped beneath the skin. His hands came up to steady his son with a gentleness that seemed at odds with their size and obvious strength. And when he finally lifted his eyes to look at Isabella, she felt the full weight of his attention like a physical force pressing against her chest. Those eyes, which she had thought were cold, were not cold at all. They were burning, consuming, filled with a pain so deep and raw that Isabella had to force herself not to look away. This was not the gaze of a dangerous man evaluating a threat, but of a human being who had just heard his dead wife's voice echoing from the lips of a stranger. The other men at the table had gone silent, their business forgotten, clearly sensing that something significant had just occurred, but not understanding what. One of them, a stocky man with graying hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, leaned forward and spoke quietly in Italian, asking Dante if there was a problem, if he needed them to handle something. But Dante didn't respond. He was still staring at Isabella, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness, and she could see his mind working, processing, calculating. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like gravel being scraped across metal, and he switched to Sicilian dialect, not the standard Italian they had been using for business, but the same regional variation Isabella's grandmother had taught her. Uni imparasti a parlare così? Where did you learn to speak like that? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. Isabella knew instinctively that her answer mattered, that this was a moment that would determine something important, though she didn't fully understand what. Her throat felt dry, her tongue thick, but she forced herself to respond honestly, because lying to this man seemed both dangerous and impossible. Me nana, Francesca Campisi Romano, Veniva da provincia di Palermo. My grandmother, Francesca Campisi Romano. She came from the province of Palermo. The change in Dante's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. Something flickered across his face. Recognition or understanding or perhaps just surprise. He shifted Luca in his lap, settling the boy more securely against his chest while keeping his eyes locked on Isabella. And she noticed for the first time how protective that hold was, how carefully he cradled his son like something infinitely precious that the world might try to steal at any moment. Then he did something that made the entire room tense. He stood up, lifting Luca with him, and took 3 steps toward Isabella, until he was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes and smell the expensive cologne that clung to his clothes. She wanted to step back, to maintain the distance that was proper between a waitress and a guest, but her feet seemed rooted to the carpet, and her pride wouldn't let her show fear. So she stood her ground and waited, the tray still balanced in her hands like a shield, while Dante studied her face with the careful attention of someone looking for a specific answer in a complicated puzzle. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, but somehow more intense, each word carefully chosen and weighted with meaning. Romano è un uomo comune, ma Campisi. Campisi è un'altra cosa. Tu sai cu era Elena Campisi Romano? Romano is a common name, but Campisi. Campisi is something else. Do you know who Elena Campisi Romano was? Isabella's heart stuttered in her chest because she did know that name. Had heard it whispered by her grandmother during those last fevered days before cancer took her. Had seen it written in faded ink on old photographs that her mother kept hidden in a shoebox under her bed. Elena had been her father's younger sister. The Aunt Isabella had never met. The girl who had disappeared from Sicily 20 years ago, under circumstances that nobody would explain. Nonna Francesca had cried when she spoke about Elena, had called her beautiful and wild and too brave for her own good, had said that losing her had broken something in the family that could never be repaired. Isabella's father, before he vanished when she was 12, had forbidden anyone from speaking Elena's name, had become violent at the mere mention of his sister, and Isabella had learned to bury her curiosity beneath layers of silence and unanswered questions. Now, standing in this private room with a Mafia boss staring at her like she held the key to salvation, those questions came rushing back with force. She opened her mouth to respond, to admit what little she knew. But Dante spoke first, his voice cracking slightly on the words like they cost him something to say aloud. Elena era me mugieri, a mamma di Luca, moriu 3 anni fa in un accidente. Elena was my wife, Luca's mother. She died 3 years ago in an accident. The world tilted sideways. Isabella's grip on the tray loosened, and it would have crashed to the floor if one of the bodyguards hadn't lunged forward to catch it, taking it from her numb fingers with practiced efficiency. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she had just heard because it was impossible, too much of a coincidence to be real. Her missing aunt, the girl who had haunted her grandmother's final days, had been married to Dante Morello, had given birth to this beautiful, solemn child, had died just 3 years ago, which meant she had been alive this whole time, while Isabella's family believed her lost forever. The questions exploded in her mind. How had Elena ended up with a Mafia boss? Why had she never contacted her family? What accident had killed her? And most importantly, why was Luca so certain that Isabella's voice sounded like his mother's? Dante must have seen something in her expression, because his face softened fractionally, the harsh lines around his mouth easing just slightly, and he reached out with his free hand to steady her elbow when she swayed. His touch was surprisingly gentle for someone with his reputation, warm through the thin fabric of her shirt, and she could feel calluses on his palm that suggested he was not merely a man who gave orders, but one who had worked with his hands. Luca, still secure against his father's chest, had gone quiet again, watching Isabella with those enormous eyes that suddenly reminded her so much of the old photographs she had seen of young Elena. The same shape, the same intensity, the same curiosity that seemed to look straight through to your soul. The boy reached out one small hand toward Isabella, not quite touching but hovering in the air between them, and his voice was whisper-soft when he spoke. Tu sai canzuna che mia mamma cantava? Dormi, dormi, bel bambin. Do you know the song my mom used to sing? Sleep, sleep, beautiful child. Isabella did know it. Her grandmother had sung it to her when she was small, a traditional Sicilian lullaby that had been passed down through generations of Romano women, and she had always assumed it was something universal, something every Italian family knew. But now, looking at this child's hopeful face, she understood that it was something more specific, something that connected her directly to Elena, to Luca, to a history she was only beginning to glimpse. Without conscious thought, she began to sing, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger with each line, the Sicilian words flowing naturally despite years of disuse. Dormi, dormi bel bambin, re diretto e paladin. Dormi, dormi, sonnolenti, cato matri ti va bene. Sleep, sleep, beautiful child, direct king and paladin. Sleep, sleep, drowsy one, for your mother loves you. Luca's face crumpled, tears spilling down his cheeks in rivulets that he made no attempt to hide, and he buried his face against his father's shoulder with a sob that sounded like it had been torn from somewhere deep inside. Dante's arms tightened around his son, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and when he looked at Isabella again, there was something new in his expression, not just pain or recognition, but a fierce, desperate hope that terrified her because she knew somehow that she had just become tangled in something far more dangerous than any Mafia business. The other men at the table had risen to their feet, clearly understanding that the meeting was over, though they couldn't possibly comprehend why, and they filed out of the room with quiet efficiency, leaving Isabella alone with Dante and Luca. The door clicked shut with a finality that made her stomach clench. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was Luca's quiet crying and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Then Dante shifted his son, settling him more comfortably, and spoke in English for the first time, his accent heavy but his words clear. You and I need to talk. Not here, not tonight, but soon. It wasn't a request. Isabella nodded because what else could she do? And she watched as Dante carried his son toward the door, pausing only to look back at her one more time. His expression was unreadable, a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't begin to untangle, but his final words were spoken in Sicilian, soft enough that she almost missed them. Grazie pi avirici ricordato che l'amore non mori mai, manco quando tutto il resto pari persu. Thank you for reminding us that love never dies, even when everything else seems lost. Isabella didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the tiny apartment she shared with her mother, staring at the water-stained ceiling and listening to the sounds of the city that never truly quieted. Sirens in the distance, neighbors arguing through thin walls, the periodic rumble of the subway beneath the building. Her mind replayed the evening's events on an endless loop, examining every detail, every word, every expression on Dante's face when he had looked at her like she was a ghost made flesh. The connection between them was impossible to ignore now, a thread pulled taut by fate or coincidence or something more sinister that she didn't want to name. When dawn finally crept through the threadbare curtains, Isabella dragged herself out of bed and went through the motions of her morning routine with mechanical precision, making coffee that she barely tasted and toast that sat like ash in her mouth. Her mother was still sleeping, the medication keeping her under longer each day, and Isabella was grateful for the solitude, even as she felt guilty about that gratitude. She needed time to think, to process, to figure out what she was going to do about the situation that had dropped into her lap, like a bomb with a timer she couldn't see. 3 days passed before Dante reached out. Isabella spent those days in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping every time the phone rang, scanning every car that pulled up outside the restaurant, certain that armed men would arrive to escort her somewhere she didn't want to go. But when the contact finally came, it was surprisingly mundane. A well-dressed woman in her 50s appeared at La Sirena di Notte during Isabella's shift, and handed her a cream-colored envelope with no return address. Inside was a card with an address in Brooklyn, and a time, 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Nothing else. No explanation, no signature, just the expectation that Isabella would understand and comply. She considered not going, considered running as far and fast as her limited funds would allow, but she knew that was pointless. If Dante Morello wanted to find her, he would find her, and refusing his invitation would only make things worse. Besides, beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else, a burning curiosity about her aunt, about what had happened to Elena, about why her presence seemed to have cracked something open in both Dante and Luca that neither of them could close again. So the next afternoon, Isabella took the subway to Brooklyn, following the directions on her phone through neighborhoods that grew progressively nicer until she found herself standing in front of a beautiful brownstone with window boxes full of late-season flowers and a black door with brass fixtures that gleamed in the autumn sunlight. It looked nothing like what she had expected. No obvious security, no menacing guards, just a quiet residential street where mothers pushed strollers and old men sat on stoops reading newspapers. She climbed the steps on legs that felt unsteady and rang the bell, hearing its echo deep inside the house. The door opened almost immediately, and Isabella found herself face to face with a woman who could only be Dante's mother. The same dark eyes, the same strong features, but softened by age and bearing an expression of kind curiosity rather than cold calculation. The woman smiled and gestured for Isabella to enter, speaking in lightly accented English. "You must be Isabella. I am Francesca Morello. Please come in. Dante is waiting for you upstairs." The name hit Isabella like a slap. Francesca, the same name as her grandmother, which was surely not a coincidence. She followed the older woman through a house that was surprisingly warm and lived in, with photographs covering the walls and comfortable furniture that showed signs of actual use. It was a family home, Isabella realized with some surprise, not the cold fortress she had imagined. They climbed to the second floor, where Francesca knocked gently on a closed door before opening it to reveal a room that was clearly meant for a child. Toys organized on shelves, a small bed with superhero sheets, drawings taped to the walls, and in the center of it all, Luca sitting cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book, while Dante sat in a chair nearby, looking impossibly large and out of place among the brightly colored decorations. Both of them looked up when Isabella entered, and the expression on Luca's face transformed from concentration to pure delight. He abandoned his coloring immediately and ran to her, stopping just short of actually touching, but bouncing on his toes with barely contained excitement. Dante stood more slowly, nodding his thanks to his mother as she quietly withdrew and closed the door, leaving the three of them alone in the space that felt simultaneously too small and too large for the conversation they needed to have. For a moment, nobody spoke, and Isabella felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Then Dante gestured to a small sofa against the wall, and his voice when he spoke was gentler than she had heard before, with none of the dangerous edge she had encountered at the restaurant. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be confusing and frightening for you. I want to explain some things, and then I hope you might be willing to share what you know about your family, about Elena's family." Isabella sat, and Luca immediately climbed up beside her, close, but not quite touching, his small presence warm against her side. She looked at Dante, really looked at him for the first time without the overlay of fear and preconception, and saw something she hadn't expected: vulnerability. This was not the cold Mafia boss of reputation, but a man who had loved and lost, who was raising a child alone, who had been knocked sideways by a chance encounter with a stranger who spoke his dead wife's dialect. He began to talk, and the story that emerged was both beautiful and tragic, filled with the kind of details that made Elena real in a way she had never been for Isabella before. Dante explained how he had met Elena 8 years ago when she was working as a translator for a shipping company that did business with his organization, how her fierce independence and sharp intelligence had attracted him despite his better judgment. how she had refused to be intimidated by his reputation or his power. They had fallen in love against all odds, against the warnings of both their families, and had married in a small ceremony with only a handful of witnesses. Elena had never spoken much about her past, Dante admitted, his voice rough with old pain. She had told him she was from Sicily, that she had left under difficult circumstances, that her family believed her dead, and it was better for everyone if it stayed that way. He had accepted that because he understood the necessity of cutting ties, of creating new identities when old ones became dangerous, and because the look in her eyes when she spoke about it made clear that this was not a subject open for discussion. They had been happy for 4 years, he said, happier than he had any right to expect given the life he led. And then, Elena had gotten pregnant, and Luca had been born. And for a brief moment, everything had been perfect. But perfection never lasted in their world. Elena had grown increasingly paranoid in the months before her death, Dante continued, his hands clenching into fists on the arms of his chair. She had started seeing threats everywhere, had insisted on changing their routines, had made Dante promise that if anything happened to her, he would protect Luca above all else, would raise him to know love rather than just power. He had thought she was being irrational, suffering from some kind of postpartum anxiety, and had tried to reassure her that she was safe, that he would never let anyone hurt her or their son. Then, 3 years ago, her car had gone off a bridge during a storm, plunging into the river below. The official report said the brakes had failed, a tragic accident, and Dante had been drowning in grief too deep to question the obvious answer. But now, looking back with the clarity that time and Isabella's appearance had provided, he was beginning to wonder if Elena's paranoia had been justified, if her death had been anything but accidental. Isabella listened to all of this in stunned silence, her mind racing to connect the pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed. When Dante finally fell silent, looking drained and older than his years, she took a shaky breath and shared what little she knew. Her grandmother's stories about Elena, the wild girl who had fallen in love with the wrong person and fled Sicily to escape a marriage arranged by their father, the family's grief and rage and eventual resignation that she must be dead because she never made contact. She told him about her own father's disappearance, about how Roberto Romano had walked out one day when Isabella was 12 and never come back, about the whispers that he had gone looking for Elena, that he had gotten involved with dangerous people, that he too was probably dead, though nobody would say it outright. As she talked, Dante's expression grew darker, more focused, and she could see his mind working through the implications of what she was telling him. When she finally ran out of words, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and fixed her with an intense stare that made her breath catch. "Your father's name was Roberto Romano?" Isabella nodded, confused by the sudden shift in his focus. Dante was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled fury. Roberto Romano was killed 6 months after Elena died. His body was found in a warehouse in Red Hook with execution-style wounds. The police never identified him because his fingerprints and face had been destroyed. But we knew. My organization knew, because before he died, he was asking questions about Elena's accident, trying to find out if it had really been an accident or if someone had ordered it. The room spun around Isabella. Her father hadn't abandoned them. He had been murdered while trying to uncover the truth about his sister's death. All these years, her mother had believed he had simply walked away, had left them to struggle alone. And the reality was so much worse, and yet somehow better, because it meant he had cared, had loved his sister enough to die trying to avenge her. Dante continued, his words coming faster now as pieces clicked into place. After Elena died, there was a restructuring in my organization. Certain people were promoted, certain territories were redistributed, and I was too broken to pay attention the way I should have. I let others handle the details while I focused on taking care of Luca, on getting through each day without completely falling apart. But if your father was killed for asking questions, that means there was something to hide. That means Elena's death might not have been an accident at all, but an assassination, a removal of someone who was seen as a weakness, or a liability, or a threat. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke, thick and suffocating. Isabella felt her hands start to shake, and Luca, who had been listening to the adult conversation with an intensity that seemed wrong for someone his age, reached out and took her hand in his small one, holding on tight like he was trying to anchor her to the present. His touch was warm and real, and it pulled Isabella back from the edge of panic that threatened to swallow her whole. She looked at this child who had lost his mother, who had been protected from the truth of how dangerous his world really was, and she felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. This boy deserved to know what had happened to Elena, deserved justice for the mother who had been stolen from him. And if Isabella was the key to unlocking that truth, then she would do whatever was necessary to see it through. Dante must have seen the determination in her face because his expression shifted, became something almost like approval. And when he spoke again, there was steel beneath the sadness. I need to investigate what happened to Elena properly. Need to follow the threads your father started pulling before they killed him. But I can't do it alone, and I can't do it openly without alerting whoever was responsible that I'm looking into it. I need someone who can move through places I can't go, ask questions without raising suspicion, someone who has a connection to Elena that gives them a legitimate reason to be curious about her past. He was asking her to help him, Isabella realized. He was asking her to put herself in danger by digging into a conspiracy that had already killed at least 2 people, possibly more, and she knew she should refuse, should walk away from this mess before it consumed her the way it had consumed everyone else who got too close. But when she looked at Luca, at his hopeful face, and his small hand still clasped around hers, she found she couldn't say no. This was her family, her aunt, her father, this child who carried Romano blood even if he bore the Morello name. She owed it to Elena, to Roberto, to her grandmother who had died mourning a lost daughter, to uncover the truth no matter what it cost. So Isabella nodded, and Dante's shoulders relaxed fractionally, and they began to plan. The investigation started slowly, carefully, with Isabella asking seemingly innocent questions of people who had known Elena in the years before her death. Dante provided names and addresses, connections that Isabella could approach without arousing suspicion, and she discovered that she had a talent for making people comfortable enough to share information they might otherwise have kept to themselves. She spoke with the woman who had been Elena's closest friend, a translator named Sofia, who still worked for the same shipping company, and who teared up when Isabella explained that she was Elena's niece, that she had only recently learned her aunt had been alive all these years. Sofia painted a picture of Elena as vibrant and fearless, someone who had embraced her new life in America with enthusiasm, but who had also been haunted by something she wouldn't discuss, a shadow from her past that she couldn't quite escape. In the months before her death, Sofia said, Elena had become withdrawn and frightened, canceling their regular coffee dates and claiming she was too busy with Luca to socialize. The last time Sofia had seen her, Elena had hugged her tightly and whispered something strange. If anything happens to me, tell Luca that his mother loved him more than life, and tell Dante to trust no one, not even family. At the time, Sofia had thought Elena was being melodramatic, possibly suffering from postpartum depression, but after the accident, those words had taken on a sinister significance she hadn't known what to do with. Isabella also tracked down the mechanic who had serviced Elena's car in the weeks before the crash, and he remembered her because she had been adamant about getting the brakes checked, insisting they felt wrong even though he had found nothing mechanically unsound. He had thought she was being paranoid, overly cautious the way new mothers sometimes were, but he had done the work anyway, replaced the brake pads, and bled the lines, and assured her everything was perfect. 2 weeks later, those same brakes had supposedly failed catastrophically enough to send her car through a guardrail and into the river. Each piece of information added to the growing picture of a woman who knew she was in danger, who had been trying to protect herself and her family, but who had ultimately failed to prevent the inevitable. Isabella shared everything she learned with Dante during regular meetings at the brownstone, sessions that started as formal debriefings, but gradually became something more comfortable as they grew accustomed to each other's presence. Luca was always there, becoming increasingly attached to Isabella, seeking her out the moment she arrived, and following her around like a devoted shadow. The boy would climb into her lap while she talked with Dante, would ask her to teach him Sicilian phrases that his mother had used, would beg her to sing the lullabies that were his only remaining connection to Elena's voice. Isabella found herself falling in love with this solemn, sweet child who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had built walls around his heart to protect against the pain of loss, but who was slowly learning to let her in. Dante noticed the bond forming between them, and Isabella sometimes caught him watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something that looked like gratitude mixed with longing, and perhaps a touch of envy. He was gentler with her now than he had been at first, more willing to share pieces of himself beyond the investigation, talking about his own childhood in Naples, about how he had been pulled into the family business before he was old enough to choose a different path, about the violence and betrayals that had shaped him into the man he had become. He spoke about Elena with a tenderness that made Isabella's chest ache, describing how she had made him believe in possibilities beyond power and fear, how she had given him Luca, and with him, a reason to want to build something better than the legacy of blood and crime that stretched back generations. In those moments, with his guard down and his voice soft, Dante seemed almost ordinary, almost human, and Isabella found herself responding to him in ways that terrified her, because she knew it was dangerous to feel anything for a man like him, dangerous to forget that his world was built on violence, and that getting close to him meant accepting that violence as part of her own life. But the heart didn't care about danger or logic, and Isabella couldn't deny that something was growing between them, something that went beyond their shared grief for Elena and their mutual determination to find justice. It was there in the way Dante's eyes followed her around the room, in the careful distance he maintained, as if afraid he might frighten her away, in the small kindnesses he showed her that seemed at odds with his reputation, making sure she had cab fare to get home safely, insisting she accept payment for the time she spent investigating, even though she had never asked for it, sending food to her apartment when he learned her mother was too ill to cook. These gestures accumulated, building a bridge between them that Isabella crossed with increasing frequency, and she began to understand why Elena had fallen in love with this complicated, damaged man who hid such capacity for tenderness beneath layers of necessary brutality. As weeks passed and the investigation deepened, darker truths began to emerge. Isabella discovered through careful questioning of Dante's associates that Elena's death had coincided with a significant shift in the organization's power structure, with certain capos gaining influence, while others who had been loyal to Dante found themselves marginalized or dead. She learned that the warehouse where her father's body had been found was controlled by one of these newly powerful men, a calculating operator named Sal Messina, who had risen from mid-level enforcer to Dante's second-in-command in the 3 years since Elena's accident. The more Isabella learned about Messina, the more convinced she became that he was connected to both deaths, but proving it was another matter entirely. And she knew from Dante's increasingly frustrated demeanor that he too was reaching similar conclusions, but lacked the evidence to act without starting a war within his own organization. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Francesca Morello, Dante's mother, who had been quietly conducting her own investigation parallel to theirs. The older woman invited Isabella to lunch one afternoon while Dante was occupied with business, and over pasta and wine in the warm kitchen of the brownstone, she revealed that she had been collecting pieces of information for years, driven by a grandmother's conviction that something about Elena's death didn't add up. Francesca had kept her suspicions to herself, because Dante had been too broken to hear them, and because she had no proof, only instinct. But Isabella's presence had given her hope that the truth might finally emerge. She produced a small box of papers, phone records she had obtained through means she didn't explain, financial statements that showed unusual payments, And most damningly, photographs of Sal Messina meeting with men who had ties to Elena's family in Sicily, the same family that had wanted her back after she fled, that had felt dishonored by her refusal to accept the marriage they had arranged. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Messina had made a deal with Elena's Sicilian relatives, promising to eliminate her in exchange for support in his bid for more power within Dante's organization. Elena's death had served multiple purposes: removing a wife that some saw as a weakness for Dante, satisfying the honor-obsessed family she had fled from, and creating the chaos and grief that allowed Messina to consolidate his position while Dante was distracted by loss. And when Roberto Romano had started asking questions, Messina had eliminated him too, covering his tracks with the same ruthless efficiency that had gotten him this far. Isabella sat in that sunny kitchen holding proof of conspiracy and murder, and she felt rage crystallize in her chest like ice turning to diamond, hard and sharp and unbreakable. This man had killed her aunt, her father, had orphaned Luca, and destroyed Dante and thought he could get away with it. Thought he was clever enough to hide his crimes behind the chaos of organizational politics and the grief of those he had betrayed. She thought about Elena, young and frightened, knowing someone wanted her dead, but unable to identify the threat, unable to protect herself despite all her precautions. She thought about her father, brave and doomed, pursuing justice for his sister, and walking straight into a trap he couldn't escape. And she thought about Luca, growing up without his mother because of one man's ambition and cruelty, and the rage inside her burned hotter, demanding action, demanding retribution. When Dante came home that evening, Isabella and Francesca were waiting for him with the evidence spread across the dining room table like an indictment. They watched as he reviewed each piece, his face growing colder and harder with each revelation, until he looked less like a man and more like the dangerous predator his reputation claimed him to be. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the final photograph, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, all the more terrifying for its softness. Sal Messina. It was Sal all along. I trusted him. I gave him power. I let him into my home, near my son, and he murdered my wife. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel and Luca's distant laughter from upstairs where he was playing, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering beneath him. Isabella reached across the table and placed her hand over Dante's, feeling the tension vibrating through him like electricity. And she understood in that moment that they had reached a point of no return. What happened next would define all of their futures, would determine whether justice or vengeance would prevail, whether Luca would grow up in a world governed by the same cycles of violence that had killed his mother, or whether something different was possible. Dante looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw past the cold facade to the man beneath, wounded and furious and desperate for resolution. His voice when he spoke was raw with emotion. This is not your fight, Isabella. You've done what I asked, found the truth, and I'm grateful beyond words. But what comes next? What I have to do to Messina and everyone who helped him? That's my world, my responsibility. You should walk away now. Take your mother and disappear somewhere safe. Let me handle this the only way I know how. But Isabella shook her head, her fingers tightening around his hand, and she spoke with a conviction that surprised even herself. Elena was my aunt, my blood. My father died trying to avenge her. This is absolutely my fight, and I'm not walking away. Not from this, and not from Luca. That boy has lost enough already. He doesn't need to lose another person who makes him feel safe and loved. Whatever you're going to do, however you're going to handle Messina, I want to be part of it. I need to be part of it, for Elena, for my father, for all of us. Something shifted in Dante's expression, a softening that made him look younger and more vulnerable, and his free hand came up to cup her cheek with a tenderness that sent shivers down her spine. When he spoke, His voice was thick with emotion. "You are extraordinary. You know that? Brave and fierce, and so much like Elena that sometimes it hurts to look at you, but also completely yourself, completely unique. If we do this, if we go after Messina together, there's no going back to your old life. You'll be part of my world, part of this family, with everything that means, the protection and the danger, the loyalty and the violence. Are you sure that's what you want?" Isabella thought about her small apartment and her dying mother, about her job at the restaurant and the mundane struggle of her ordinary life. And she realized that she had stopped belonging to that world the moment she spoke Sicilian to a 6-year-old boy and watched his father's carefully constructed walls crumble. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, had become entangled in something bigger and darker and more important than her own safety or comfort. And somewhere along the way, she had fallen in love, with Luca certainly, but also with this complicated, damaged man who looked at her like she was both miracle and torment, who had shown her glimpses of the person he could have been if the world had been kinder. So she nodded, and Dante's hand on her cheek trembled slightly. And then he was leaning forward, closing the distance between them, and his lips touched hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible, given everything he was, everything he had done. The kiss was brief, barely more than a brush of contact, but it sealed something between them, a promise, or perhaps a warning that they were in this together now, bound by more than just shared purpose. Francesca cleared her throat from the doorway where she had discreetly withdrawn, and they broke apart, both slightly flushed, while Dante's mother smiled with a knowing expression that suggested she had seen this coming long before either of them had admitted it to themselves. She spoke in Italian, her voice warm with approval. "Your father would have liked her, Dante. She has the Romano fire, the same strength that Elena had. Don't let pride or fear keep you from holding on to what you've found here, because second chances are rare in our world, and you've been given something precious." The next 2 weeks were a careful dance of preparation and strategy, as Dante orchestrated the downfall of Sal Messina with the precision of a master conductor, leading a lethal symphony. Isabella watched in fascinated horror as the man she had grown to care for transformed into the cold, calculating boss his reputation promised, moving pieces across a board only he could see, building a case that would justify Messina's execution, not just to Dante himself, but to the organization's ruling council that would need to approve such a significant action. She learned that there were rules even in the criminal underworld, hierarchies and protocols that had to be observed, and that eliminating a high-ranking member without proper justification could trigger the kind of internal war that would destroy everything Dante had built. So the evidence had to be presented carefully, irrefutably, in a way that left no room for doubt or competing loyalties. Isabella's role in this deadly theater was complex and multifaceted. She became the living proof of Elena's Romano lineage, the connection that explained why Messina might have made deals with Sicilian families, and her father's murder became the thread that tied everything together into a narrative of betrayal and ambition that even the most skeptical council members couldn't dismiss. Dante coached her on what to say and how to present herself, but he also trusted her intelligence and instincts, allowing her to speak with her own voice rather than trying to script every word. She met with council members in carefully orchestrated encounters, sharing her story with a quiet intensity that made her grief and anger palpable, and she watched as hardened criminals who had seen every kind of violence found themselves moved by the tragedy of a family, destroyed by one man's greed. Throughout this process, Isabella continued spending time with Luca, maintaining the illusion of normalcy for the child who had already experienced too much loss. She read him stories and helped with homework, taught him more Sicilian phrases, and answered his endless questions about his mother with an honesty tempered by age-appropriate caution. Luca had begun calling her Zia Isabella, Aunt Isabella, a title that made her heart clench every time she heard it, because it acknowledged the blood connection between them, while also creating a bond that went beyond mere genetics. This boy needed her, and she needed him, and together they were building something that felt like family, even though the foundation was laid on secrets and violence and grief. Dante watched these interactions with an expression that Isabella was learning to read, recognizing the way his features softened when he looked at them together, the way his shoulders relaxed fractionally, as if some burden he carried grew temporarily lighter. He had started touching her more. Casual contacts at first, a hand at the small of her back when guiding her through doorways, fingers brushing hers when passing documents, shoulders bumping when they sat together reviewing evidence. These touches accumulated, building a physical awareness between them that hummed with potential energy, and Isabella found herself hyper-aware of his proximity, of the scent of his cologne and the warmth radiating from his body, and the way his voice dropped lower when he spoke to her alone. They hadn't kissed again since that first time in the dining room, both of them holding back as if by unspoken agreement that they needed to resolve the Messina situation before allowing themselves to explore whatever was growing between them. The confrontation, when it finally came, was both anticlimactic and terrifying in its cold efficiency. The council meeting was held in a private room at a social club in Staten Island, with 8 men seated around a long table, while Dante presented his case with the controlled fury of someone who had been wronged in the most fundamental way possible. Isabella sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling, while Messina stood across the table looking progressively more trapped as each piece of evidence was revealed. He tried to bluster, to deflect, to claim that the accusations were fabrications designed to eliminate a political rival, but the phone records and financial statements and witness testimonies were too comprehensive, too damning, and his denials rang hollow, even to his own ears. The council deliberated for less than 10 minutes before returning their verdict. Messina had violated sacred rules of the organization by plotting against a boss's family, and the penalty was death. The sentence would be carried out immediately, in the traditional manner, and no one would speak his name again, except as a cautionary tale about the consequences of betrayal. Isabella watched as Messina's face drained of color, as he looked around the table seeking support that didn't exist, and then as 2 large men stepped forward to escort him from the room toward whatever end awaited him in the building's basement. Dante didn't follow, didn't need to witness the execution he had orchestrated, but his hand found Isabella's under the table and squeezed with a pressure that spoke of relief and rage and grief all tangled together. They left the social club 20 minutes later, stepping out into a cold November evening where the first snow of the season was beginning to fall in soft flakes that caught the streetlights. Dante's driver was waiting with the car, but Dante waved him off, suddenly needing to walk, to move, to put distance between himself and what had just happened. Isabella walked beside him without question, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, while snow accumulated on their hair and shoulders, and the city around them continued its indifferent rhythm. They walked for blocks without speaking, passing closed storefronts and late-night diners, and the occasional pedestrian hurrying home, until they reached a small park overlooking the water where the Manhattan skyline glittered across the dark expanse of the harbor. Dante stopped at the railing, gripping the cold metal with both hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. "It's done. Messina is dead. The traitors who helped him are being dealt with, and Elena can rest now knowing that justice was served. But it doesn't feel like I thought it would. I thought there would be satisfaction, closure, some sense that the scales had been balanced. Instead, I just feel empty. She's still gone. Your father is still gone, and no amount of vengeance can bring them back or undo the damage that was done." Isabella moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she stared out at the water while choosing her words carefully. "Vengeance never fixes what was broken, it just prevents the same people from breaking anything else. But you did more than seek vengeance today, Dante. You exposed corruption in your organization, eliminated threats to your family, and showed everyone that betrayal has consequences. That matters. And Elena, I think she would be proud that you found the truth, that you didn't let her death be dismissed as an accident, that you fought for her memory even though it cost you. Dante turned to look at her, and in the glow of the streetlights, she could see tears tracking down his cheeks, the first time she had seen him cry, and it made him seem simultaneously more human and more dangerous, because this was a man who allowed himself to feel deeply, despite the world he inhabited. His voice broke when he spoke. I loved her so much. I still love her. But these past weeks, working with you, watching you with Luca, I felt something I didn't think I was capable of feeling again. And I don't know what to do with that, because it feels like betrayal, like I'm dishonoring her memory by wanting to move forward, by wanting. He trailed off, but Isabella understood what he couldn't say, felt the same confusion and guilt about the feelings that had developed between them. She reached up to wipe the tears from his face with gentle fingers, and her voice was soft but firm. Helena loved you enough to give you Luca, to fight to stay alive when she knew she was in danger, to leave you with memories instead of bitterness. I don't think she would want you to spend the rest of your life alone and grieving. I think she would want you to be happy, to give Luca a home filled with love instead of just security, to honor what you had together by building something new rather than treating your heart like a tomb that nothing can enter. Dante caught her hand against his cheek, turned his face to press a kiss to her palm, and the gesture was so tender that Isabella felt her own tears start to fall. When he pulled her into his arms, she went willingly, burrowing into his warmth, while snow continued to fall around them, and the city continued its endless rhythm of life and death and renewal. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other, while the worst of the grief and rage and fear drained away, replaced by something quieter and more hopeful. The possibility that they could build something together from the ruins of what had been lost. That they could honor the dead by living fully rather than by merely surviving. Eventually, the cold drove them back to the waiting car, and Dante's driver took them to the brownstone where Francesca had been watching Luca. The boy was already asleep, exhausted from a day at school and an evening of play, but he woke briefly when Isabella came to check on him, his sleepy eyes focusing on her face with trust and affection. He reached out to her, and she sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his dark curls while he mumbled something in Italian about a dream he'd been having. Then, with the unfiltered honesty of childhood, he asked the question that had been building for weeks. Zia Isabella, are you going to stay with us? Like, stay, not just visit? Isabella looked up to find Dante standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression that was equal parts hope and fear, waiting for her answer. She thought about her mother, who was being cared for in a facility Dante had quietly arranged and paid for without being asked, who was finally receiving the treatment she needed without the crushing burden of debt. She thought about her tiny apartment that had never felt like home, about the restaurant job that had been nothing more than survival, about the life she had been living that felt hollow compared to the richness and danger and love she had found here. And she thought about this child who looked at her like she hung the moon, and this man who had shown her that even damaged people could heal if they found the right reason. And she knew that her answer had been decided long before the question was asked. Yes, Pichiridru, she said softly, using the Sicilian endearment that Luca loved. I'm going to stay. If that's what you want, and if your papa agrees, then this is my home now, and you're my family. Luca's face split into a grin of pure joy, and he threw his arms around her neck with the wholehearted enthusiasm of children who haven't yet learned to guard their emotions. Over his shoulder, Isabella met Dante's eyes, and the expression she saw there made her breath catch. Gratitude and desire, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. But that felt inevitable, like gravity or sunrise or any other force of nature that couldn't be resisted no matter how hard you tried. The transition from Isabella's old life to her new one happened with surprising speed, as if the universe had been waiting for her decision before setting everything in motion. She moved out of her cramped apartment within a week, bringing only her most precious possessions: her grandmother's photographs, some books, the few pieces of jewelry that had survived their family's various upheavals, to the brownstone that was now officially her home. Francesca welcomed her with open arms and practical efficiency, showing her to a room on the 3rd floor that had been hastily but thoughtfully prepared, with fresh paint and new curtains, and a comfortable bed that felt impossibly luxurious after years of sleeping on a worn-out mattress in a building where the heat barely worked. The older woman made it clear that Isabella was family now, not a guest or an employee, and that she was expected to make herself at home in every sense of the word. Luca was ecstatic about the arrangement, following Isabella around like a devoted puppy, and insisting on showing her every toy, every book, every corner of the house, as if she hadn't already spent countless hours there over the past weeks. He chattered constantly in a mixture of English and Italian, his enthusiasm boundless, and Isabella found herself laughing more in those first few days than she had in years. The boy's joy was infectious, healing something inside her that she hadn't realized was broken, and she understood why Elena had been willing to risk everything to protect this child, why Dante would kill or die to keep him safe. Dante himself was more reserved about the new living arrangement, maintaining a careful distance that Isabella recognized as an attempt to give her space and time to adjust. He was unfailingly polite, unfailingly considerate, treating her with a respect that bordered on formality except during those moments when Luca demanded they all do something together and the walls temporarily came down. They read bedtime stories as a trio, Dante and Isabella sitting on opposite sides of Luca's bed, while the boy picked stories he wanted to hear. They ate family dinners that Francesca insisted on, gathering around the kitchen table rather than in the formal dining room, because, as she said, families ate together and shared their days with each other. They took walks in the neighborhood on weekends, Dante's security team following at a discreet distance while Luca ran ahead, pointing out dogs and collecting interesting leaves, and generally being the normal, happy child he should have been all along. During these activities, Isabella and Dante would exchange glances over Luca's head, small moments of connection that spoke volumes about the awareness building between them. But Dante never pushed, never presumed, and Isabella found herself both grateful for his restraint and frustrated by it, because the tension between them was becoming almost unbearable. She would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, his expression unguarded and hungry, and she knew her own face probably showed the same longing. They were dancing around each other, held back by grief and guilt, and the fear of moving too fast. But the inevitable conclusion was becoming harder to avoid with each passing day. The breaking point came on a cold December evening, nearly 3 months after that first encounter in La Sirena di Notte, when Luca had been put to bed and Francesca had retired to her own suite, leaving Isabella and Dante alone in the living room, with a fire crackling in the fireplace and snow falling heavily outside the windows. They had been reviewing some business documents. Dante had started including her in certain aspects of the legitimate side of his operations, valuing her intelligence and fresh perspective. But the work was complete, and the silence between them stretched with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, Dante set down his glass of whiskey and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Isabella, we need to talk about what this is, what we're becoming. I care about you, more than I should probably admit. But I need to know where your head is at, what you want from this situation, because I can't keep pretending that having you here is just about Luca, or about honoring Elena's memory, or about anything other than the fact that I'm falling in love with you. And I don't know if that's okay, or if I'm putting pressure on you that you don't want." The admission hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable, and Isabella felt her heart racing because this was the moment where everything changed, where they either moved forward together or retreated to safer, lonelier ground. She thought about all the reasons why this was complicated. Elena's memory, the dangerous world Dante inhabited, the fact that she had only known him for 3 months, and most people would call that too soon to make life-altering decisions. But she also thought about how safe she felt here, How right it felt to be part of Luca's life. How Dante made her feel seen and valued in ways she had never experienced before. And she thought about her grandmother's stories of great loves that defied logic and convention, of Romeo and Juliet, minus the tragedy, of people who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from unpromising circumstances. So Isabella stood and crossed the space between them, took Dante's face between her hands the way Luca had done that first night, and looked directly into his eyes when she spoke. "I'm falling in love with you too. Maybe I have been since that first moment when you looked at me like I was a ghost and a miracle at the same time. I know it's fast. I know it's complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this might be a terrible idea. But I also know that I've never felt more alive than I do here, with you and Luca, and I don't want to walk away from that because of fear or propriety or anything else. So yes, Dante, I want this. I want us. Whatever that means, whatever that becomes, I'm in." The kiss that followed was nothing like that first tentative brush of lips in the dining room. This was heat and hunger and desperation, months of tension finally released, and Isabella found herself pressed back against the couch with Dante's weight solid and warm above her, while the fire crackled and snow fell, and the world outside ceased to matter. They made love with a passion that felt both urgent and reverent, taking their time despite the need, learning each other's bodies with careful attention. And when it was over, they lay tangled together in the firelight, breathing hard and slightly stunned by the intensity of what they had just shared. Dante held her close, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, and his voice was rough when he spoke. "I need you to understand what you're signing up for by being with me. There will always be danger. Always be the possibility that enemies will try to hurt me through you or Luca. There will be secrets I can't share. Business I have to conduct that you won't want to know about. Times when I'll have to be someone you might not recognize. And there will always be Elena's shadow, her memory, because she was important to me and she gave me Luca. And I can't pretend she never existed." Isabella raised herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with steady eyes. "I don't want you to forget Elena. She was my aunt. She's part of Luca's history. And the love you had for her is part of what made you who you are. I'm not trying to replace her or erase her. I'm just trying to build something new alongside those memories. As for the danger and the secrets, I went into this with my eyes open, Dante. I know who you are, what you do, and I'm choosing this anyway, because I believe you're worth it, because Luca is worth it, because this family we're building is worth it." He pulled her back down, kissing her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears, and they held each other while the fire burned low and eventually guttered out, neither of them wanting to break the spell by moving. Eventually, they relocated to Dante's bedroom, a space Isabella had never entered before, and she noticed immediately the absence of photographs or mementos, as if Dante had deliberately kept this room neutral and impersonal. She understood that this was his way of moving forward rather than living in the past, and she felt a surge of love for this complicated man who was trying so hard to do right by everyone. By Elena's memory, by Luca's needs, by Isabella's heart. They spent the night wrapped around each other, talking and dozing and making love again with less urgency and more exploration, learning what made each other gasp and sigh, building the intimate knowledge that came from truly seeing and being seen. By morning, something had fundamentally shifted between them, a commitment made without words, but understood nonetheless. And when Luca bounded into the room at dawn demanding pancakes, he stopped short at the sight of them together, his eyes going wide before a huge grin spread across his face. He launched himself onto the bed with zero hesitation, wedging himself between them and announcing that this was the best morning ever, because now they were a real family like the ones on TV. The months that followed were a period of adjustment and joy, as they figured out how to blend their lives together into something cohesive. Isabella officially adopted a role in Dante's legitimate businesses, using her education and natural intelligence to help manage the shipping company where Elena had once worked, finding fulfillment in work that challenged her while remaining mostly separate from the darker aspects of Dante's world. She and Dante were married in a small ceremony that spring, with only family and close friends in attendance, and Luca served as ring-bearer with such serious dedication that everyone fought back tears of laughter and love. The wedding was held in the garden behind the brownstone, with flowers blooming and sunlight streaming through the trees, and when the priest asked if anyone objected, Luca had stood up with perfect comic timing and announced that he objected to there not being cake yet, breaking the tension and making everyone laugh. Isabella became Mama Isabella to Luca, a compromise they had reached after long discussions about respecting Elena's place in his heart, while also acknowledging the maternal role Isabella had assumed. The boy seemed to understand instinctively that he could love both his mothers, that honoring Elena's memory didn't mean he couldn't accept Isabella's love, and his adjustment to the new family structure was remarkably smooth. He started doing better in school, his teachers commenting on how much happier he seemed, how much more willing he was to participate and make friends. And Isabella and Dante would exchange proud glances at parent-teacher conferences like any normal couple celebrating their child's success. But the final, most significant change came when Dante announced his intention to step back from active leadership of the organization, to transition power to carefully chosen successors, while he focused on the legitimate businesses that could be passed down to Luca without the burden of blood and violence. It was a process that would take years, requiring careful planning and political maneuvering to ensure that his enemies didn't interpret the transition as weakness. But Dante was determined to build a legacy that didn't end in prison or assassination. He wanted to be there to walk Luca down the aisle at his wedding someday, to meet his grandchildren, to grow old with Isabella without constantly looking over his shoulder, and he was willing to work for that future with the same determination he had once applied to building criminal empire. As part of this transition, Dante decided to honor Elena's memory in a concrete way that would benefit others who had suffered as she had. He established a foundation dedicated to helping women and children escape dangerous situations, providing resources for those fleeing abusive relationships or organized crime connections, and he named Isabella as the director of the project because she understood better than anyone what it meant to be caught between worlds, to need an escape route, but have nowhere to turn. The Foundation's flagship project was an orphanage and community center in Palermo, Sicily, built in the neighborhood where Elena had grown up, offering hope and opportunity to children who might otherwise be recruited into the same criminal life that had ultimately killed her. The grand opening of the Palermo Center happened on a brilliant June day, 2 years after that first encounter in the restaurant, and the entire family traveled to Sicily for the ceremony. Isabella stood on the steps of the beautiful new building, Luca holding her hand on one side while Dante stood on the other, and she thought about all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. A chance greeting in Sicilian, a boy's innocent observation, a conspiracy uncovered, love found in the ruins of grief. Her grandmother would have called it destiny, would have said that the Romano women were survivors who turned tragedy into triumph, and looking at the crowd gathered to celebrate this new beginning, Isabella thought Nonna Francesca might have been right. The ceremony concluded with Isabella cutting a ribbon while local officials and community leaders applauded, and then Luca tugged on her hand, pulling her down to his level so he could whisper in her ear. His question was simple but profound, asked in the Sicilian dialect that had become their secret language, the bridge between past and present. Posso chiamarti mamma ora, senza u Isabella? Pirci si a me vera mamma, proprio como ira era. Can I call you Mom now, without the Isabella? Because you're my real mother, just like she was. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she looked at this child who had changed everything, who had been the catalyst for love and healing and redemption, and she pulled him into a tight hug while nodding against his hair. Over his shoulder, she met Dante's eyes and saw in them the same emotion she felt: gratitude and love, and the kind of peace that came from knowing you had finally found your place in the world. When they finally separated, Dante crouched down beside them and added his own arms to the embrace, creating a circle of 3 that felt complete and right. And he spoke in Sicilian, his voice thick with emotion but strong. La famiglia è tornata a casa. Elena, tuo padre, tu uccidi che perdiru u camino. Tutti hanno trovato riparuca, into l'amore caristao. The family has come home. Elena, your father, all those who lost their way. They've all found shelter here, in the love that remained.